Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. What happens to a society when the very people who physically built the foundation of its economic miracle are left to forage and farm in their 70s just to survive?
It's um it's a profound, almost haunting question, really. And honestly, it's one that shifts our entire perspective on how economic progress is actually measured, on a human level.
Yeah, definitely. Today, we are taking a close look at a striking article from The Economist. It explores a pressing demographic and economic reality, which is China's massive urban-rural pension gap.
Right. The scale of it is just massive.
Exactly. But our mission here isn't just to, throw a bunch of economic statistics at you. We are going to examine the underlying assumptions behind how any society actually values things like productive years versus formal employment.
And that's so important because we want to understand what this staggering disparity really means for a population that is aging at a speed the world has, well, rarely seen before.
Okay, let's unpack this. If you really think about the structure being described in this article, it is almost like a national loyalty program.
A loyalty program. How so?
Well, it's one where the basic requirements for survival are suddenly tiered based on your zip code and your job history. Imagine reaching the finish line of a grueling, decades-long marathon.
Right.
But the reward you receive is entirely dependent on whether you were wearing the officially approved corporate uniform while you were running, rather than the fact that you ran the race at all. So why is this specific gap, this two-tiered system, becoming so impossible to ignore right now?
So the urgency really comes down to a very stark demographic reality that's colliding with an economic slowdown. I mean, China's population is aging incredibly rapidly.
Right. It's not a slow transition.
No, not at all. We are not talking about a slow multi-generational shift like we saw in Western Europe or the United States. This is a demographic cliff, and it's happening right now. Yeah. And as these demographics shift, this immense structural disparity between urban and rural retirement benefits is being forced into the spotlight. The sheer volume of rural seniors who are struggling simply to buy basic food and medicine is, making the gap hyper-visible.
Yeah, it's no longer just a line item on an economic policy spreadsheet, is it?
Exactly. It is a visible, physical, daily reality in towns, suburbs, and cities across the country.
Yeah, and that physical visibility is, it's really brought to life in the opening of the article. It paints an incredibly vivid, almost jarring picture.
It really does.
Because when we start looking at this, we aren't looking at an abstract policy paper. We are looking at, of all things, the Chongqing subway.
Right, which is the urban transit system of one of the world's most populous municipalities.
Yes. The article describes elderly farmers in Chongqing using this hyper-modern, gleaming city subway system to transport their agricultural produce straight into urban markets. And, they are doing this quite deliberately.
Oh, absolutely. They are hauling bamboo baskets full of vegetables onto high-speed commuter trains just to bypass the wholesale buyers.
Right, and they do this just to earn a slightly better margin on the food they grow. I mean, we are talking about saving pennies on the dollar here, but those pennies are the difference between eating and going hungry.
It is a highly striking visual contrast. You have this direct intersection of traditional, backbreaking manual agricultural labor happening right inside the climate-controlled, state-of-the-art infrastructure of a fast-paced urban center.
And the article points out that the local government has put practical accommodations in place for this. Travel on the subway is free for anyone over the age of 65.
Oh, wow.
Plus, the fees these farmers pay at the urban markets to set up a stall and sell their produce are described as nominal. Now, on the surface, if you just glance at a headline, you might think, oh, how nice. The city is making space for the rural elderly. They get free subway rides.
Yeah, it sounds like a heartwarming story of civic infrastructure, accommodating the older generation, giving them access to the bustling city economy.
But I really have to question whether that is the right framing at all. Reading between the lines, it's a bit like praising a hospital for giving free parking to a patient who can't actually afford the life-saving surgery they need.
That's a great way to put it.
Are these free subway rides and cheap market fees really a heartwarming accommodation? Or are they just a Band-Aid? It feels like they are masking a massive systemic failure. If you need to haul 50 pounds of cabbage on a train at age 75 to survive, a free ticket doesn't mean the system is working for you.
What's fascinating here is how these so-called accommodations actually act as a distraction from the root mechanical issue. You mentioned the free parking analogy, and it is incredibly apt when we look at how the government allocates resources.
No, so.
Well, the physical infrastructure, the subways, The high-speed rail, the wholesale markets, it is completely modernized. It is world-class. But the social welfare infrastructure that is supposed to support the human beings using those trains is entirely stuck in the 1990s.
The social contract simply hasn't modernized at the same speed as the subway cars?
Not even close. And to understand why, we have to draw a very clear technical line between a safety net program and a formal pension.
Right.
What these rural seniors are relying on is fundamentally just a fiscal safety net. Mechanically, a formal pension is designed around income replacement. You pay in a percentage of your salary, your employer matches it, and when you retire, you get a percentage of your working income back to maintain your lifestyle.
Which makes sense.
But a safety net is entirely different. It is funded out of general local government budgets. It was never designed to provide a comfortable retirement. It was designed by policymakers to simply prevent utter destitution and starvation. And when you realize that mechanical difference, the image of a 70-year-old farmer hauling heavy bags of produce onto a commuter train stops looking like a charming civic accommodation and starts looking like a desperate systemic necessity.
When you see a 70-year-old bypassing a wholesaler just to save a few pennies, you have to ask what kind of baseline support leaves them with absolutely no margin for error, which means we have to, follow the money. We have to look at the stark contrast in state support to understand their desperation.
We really do. The numerical breakdown in the article is where the reality of this two-tiered system truly sets in.
So let's break down the specific numbers because they are staggering. If you are a rural retiree without a formal employment history on paper, your baseline monthly pension is a mere 163 yuan a month.
Just 163 yuan. I mean, for context, that is roughly $22 for an entire month of survival.
$22 a month. It's unbelievable. Now let's contrast that directly. For an urban enterprise retiree, someone who worked a formal corporate or factory job in the city, their pension is around 3,500 yuan a month.
Which is, well, a huge jump.
Yeah. And if you look at former public sector workers like bureaucrats or state enterprise managers, their monthly pension is nearly 7,000 yuan.
The multiplier there is just staggering. I mean, you are looking at a system where a retired public sector worker receives over 40 times the amount that a rural farmer receives.
40 times. It is almost hard to wrap your head around that kind of gap. I have to ask mechanically, how does the system even justify that internally? How do policymakers look at a 40x gap and say, yes, this is how our economy should function?
Yeah, so if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really comes down to how these different systems are funded and the historical assumptions built into them. Urban pensions, as I mentioned, are largely funded by payroll contributions. So this is a system built around formal, documented employment. Money goes in from your paycheck over decades, it goes into a massive pool, and then money comes out when you retire. It is structurally designed to sustain a middle-class lifestyle.
Right.
But more importantly, it is backed by the wealthiest parts of the country, the urban centers that have seen massive economic growth.
Because it's tied to the formal economy that generated all that wealth.
Precisely. But the rural benefits, well, they are not tied to that payroll history. They are funded largely by local municipalities and provincial governments. And here is the mechanical problem. Local rural governments in China just do not have the same massive tax base as places like Shanghai or Shenzhen.
Makes sense.
For years, local governments relied heavily on selling land to developers to fund their budgets. But with the recent property market slump in China, those local government revenues are drying up. So even if a local rural mayor wanted to increase that 163 yuan payout, the money simply isn't in the municipal bank account to do it. The central government provides some subsidies, but the system is structurally decentralized in a way that really disadvantages rural areas.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. When we talk about this system rewarding formal employment, it carries this inherent, almost arrogant assumption that formal payroll taxed labor is the only labor that actually counts toward building a nation's wealth.
Yeah, that is the core macroeconomic assumption underpinning the entire structure, yes.
But the article highlights a statistic that, well, it blows a hole right through that assumption. Over 80% of able-bodied rural residents between the ages of 60 and 80 are still working.
80% of that demographic. I mean, just let that sink in.
And we aren't talking about them sitting at a desk consulting a few hours a week to keep their minds sharp.
No, not at all.
The article specifically notes they're performing manual labor. They are working on small, difficult patches of ground, or even more shockingly, they are foraging.
Yeah, literally foraging in the wild for herbs or mushrooms or scavenging recyclables just for basic survival.
Well, I have to ask you, and really pose this to you listening right now, if 80% of your elderly population is still doing physical manual labor just to buy cooking oil, is it even legally or ethically accurate to call them retirees?
From a purely functional standpoint, no. They haven't retired at all. They have just aged out of the formal definition of the workforce while continuing the physical act of working.
Exactly.
The very label of retiree implies a cessation of labor funded by past contributions to society. But for this specific demographic, the labor never ceases until their bodies physically give out.
Which naturally brings us to a massive debate about history and fairness. Because if these people are forging at 70, we have to ask what they were doing at 30. How are policymakers, or even economists, defining productive years and contributions? Because clearly the current definition is leaving hundreds of millions of people out in the cold.
This is exactly the point that advocates and sociologists in the article are, well, desperately trying to highlight. They argue that we need to fundamentally redefine how we look at the concept of productive years.
Right.
We are talking about a generation of rural elderly who didn't just sit around in their youth. They were the engine of the economic miracle.
Right. They're the ones who physically built the cities.
Precisely. I mean, in the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, millions of these rural residents became migrant workers. They moved to the urban centers, worked on the construction sites, poured the concrete, laid the roads, and they fueled the massive manufacturing boom that defined China's rise to a global superpower. But here's the critical mechanical catch.
What's that?
Because of China's hukou system, which is essentially a household registration system, these workers were officially classified as rural residents, even if they lived and worked in a city for 20 years.
Wait, let me make sure I understand this, because this feels like the missing puzzle piece. Are you saying that even if a worker spent 20 years building skyscrapers in Beijing, because their official registration, their hukou, was tied to a rural village, their urban employer wasn't obligated to pay into a formal pension for them?
Exactly. Or, even if some contributions were made, it was notoriously difficult to port those urban pension benefits back to their rural home province when they eventually left the city.
That's crazy.
The formal economic models heavily prioritized documented continuous payroll contributions for permanent urban residents. So the migrant workers were treated as temporary labor, legally speaking, which meant they were excluded from the long-term wealth they were helping to generate.
That is incredible. And what about the people who stayed behind? I mean, not everyone migrated to the cities.
Right. And for those who stayed behind and farmed, they paid a massive price as well. For decades, the government utilized something known as the scissors price gap.
The scissors price gap?
Yeah. They kept the state-mandated purchasing price of agricultural goods artificially low while keeping the price of industrial goods high.
Oh.
Essentially, they heavily taxed the rural agricultural sector to subsidize the rapid industrialization of the cities. It wasn't until 2006 that the agricultural tax was finally abolished. So, the rural population funded the early stages of the economic miracle through their crops.
So let me get this straight. They either provided the cheap physical muscle as migrant workers to build the cities, or they provided the heavily taxed agricultural goods to fund the cities.
Right.
And yet, when they hit 65, their past labor is mathematically discounted in the current pension model. Why is their past labor entirely discounted? It's as if you built a massive, luxurious house with your own two hands, but because you weren't on the official corporate payroll of the construction company, you aren't allowed to live in it.
That's a great analogy.
You just have to stand outside in the freezing cold and watch the people with the right paperwork enjoy the warmth by the fire.
It is a very poignant and unfortunately accurate metaphor. The formal economic models simply don't have a ledger for informal labor, migrant work, and small-scale farming, even when those exact activities were the structural foundation of the nation's wealth.
And to make matters worse, the article mentions that there is a heavy reliance on family support as part of the official policy solution. Families are just, well, expected to step up, practice filial piety, and care for their elders.
Right.
But isn't that just a convenient excuse? I mean, is relying on family support just a way for policymakers to avoid footing the bill for a generation that gave everything to the state?
Well, this raises an important question about the complex and frankly brutal macroeconomic trade-offs currently dominating these policy debates.
How so?
It is absolutely true that filial piety and family support are deeply ingrained, beautiful cultural values. But economically, leaning on that cultural value shifts the financial burden entirely from the state ledger onto the shoulders of the younger generations.
Right. And the younger generation is dealing with their own massive crises. They're facing high youth unemployment, brutal work cultures, and, skyrocketing costs of living.
Exactly.
They can't necessarily afford to completely subsidize their aging parents' housing, food, and medical care.
And this is the ultimate dilemma for the central government. I mean, if they were to significantly increase the rural baseline pension, say raising at 163 yuan up to a livable standard of even 1,000 yuan a month for hundreds of millions of rural seniors, it would require an astronomical, unprecedented amount of capital.
Yeah.
They are trying to balance massive ongoing infrastructure spending, technological investment, and the desperate push for continued economic growth against this profound moral and social obligation to their aging informal workforce.
It's an impossible situation.
It really is. It is a harsh fiscal constraint. I mean, where does the money come from without stalling the entire economy?
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? Why should you care about the mechanics of a pension gap in a country you might not live in?
It's a fair question.
Because honestly, this isn't just an isolated economic policy happening thousands of miles away. It is a profound, real-time case study on how a modern society values human labor and how social safety nets are fundamentally misaligned with reality.
It truly is. The mechanics we are discussing here, well, they are playing out in different forms all over the globe.
Exactly. If standard economic models inherently only protect formal, payroll-taxed workers with unbroken corporate histories, what does that mean for the rest of the world? We're currently seeing a massive global rise in informal economies and gig work.
Oh, completely.
If you are driving for a rideshare app or doing freelance coding or working on short-term contracts, you are part of a massive global informal workforce.
Right.
You are generating immense value for tech platforms and cities. But if governments around the world only reward traditional 20th century payroll histories, we might be looking at our own future crises.
Yeah, that's the danger.
We could be creating a future where millions of elderly gig workers are left to fend for themselves because their labor didn't fit neatly into a corporate ledger.
That is the broader, undeniable global implication. I mean, we are seeing a structural shift away from traditional employment everywhere, which means the welfare states and safety nets built for the industrial economy of the 20th century are increasingly obsolete.
Yeah.
Or at least severely out of touch with the realities of 21st century labor.
The structures just don't match the reality of how people are actually surviving, working, and contributing to society.
Which leaves us with a final and frankly uncomfortable question to consider long after this discussion ends.
Okay.
If an economic miracle was largely subsidized by the cheap labor, the physical bodies, and the agricultural taxes of a generation that is now left to fend for itself, does treating their retirement merely as a fiscal constraint, rather than a debt owed, permanently break the social contract for the next generation of workers?
Wow. That is heavy.
Think about the psychology of it. When young people, who are already navigating an incredibly uncertain, high-pressure economy, look at how the builders of yesterday are treated today. When they see their grandparents hauling vegetables on the subway at 70 years old just to survive.
Right.
How does that change their willingness to sacrifice for the state tomorrow? If the ultimate reward for a lifetime of informal, back-breaking labor is $22 a month, why would the next generation invest their loyalty, their sweat, and their future in that system?
It is a profound question that every single society transitioning into a new economic era is going to have to answer one way or another. You cannot build the future by ignoring the people who built your past.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.